Simultaneous assessment of mammalian viruses by gene expression. Oh, I've just said this, so I'm going to skip. Morovska and her colleagues from Latvia reported on HHV6 and 7 reactivation in patients with CFS compared with healthy blood donors, and found that let's focus on this, that the combination of active HHV6 and 7 infection was much higher in the CFS patients than in the blood donors. In fact, it was not found. Cameron and her colleagues from the Dubbo study did not find any evidence that EBV or HHV6 were particularly reactivated in the patients with post-infectious fatigue states that were either linked to acute EBV infection or not, but very small number of cases, a negative result of a relatively small number of cases. Cameron was asked, and Andrew also responded this morning to the question, why do some studies but not others find links with infectious agents? Or, same question, with infectious fatigue syndromes and cytokines. And the answers that Dr. Cameron gave, with which I agree, are that there's been a lot of heterogeneity among the groups studied under the label of CFS. In fact, as Andrew pointed out this morning, it's not documented that post-infectious fatigue syndrome is in fact the same thing as endogenous or sporadic CFS that comes to our private practice offices. There's also very considerable difference, as was discussed this morning, in assays for infectious agents, for cytokines. And obviously, the more sensitive assays are more likely to find infectious agents. On the other hand, less specific assays are more likely to find them when they're not really there. So I think a lot of the differences in the literature probably reflect these two differences. Some studies have not had much of a sample size, and as was pointed out this morning, virtually all of these studies are on blood. And if you believe that the action may be elsewhere, such as in the central nervous system, then you're not really looking at the right tissue when you're looking for infectious agents or for the role of cytokines, etc. What about the role of stress? There were several papers here that talked about the role of stress, and I know that when the CDC paper about 6 months ago was published, a very good paper in my view, identifying the importance of early life stressors, early life trauma in increasing vulnerability to CFS later in life. There were many people who were outraged because what they believed that the paper was saying was that CFS is caused by stress. And not only did they believe that, but they believed that stress was a weakness of character. And if they were suffering from this illness, they didn't like being told that they had a weak character. In fact, in my mind, that's not what the study showed. In fact, the study and many other studies presented here today at this meeting have shown that stress, or rather the body's physical response to a stressor, which is a more precise phrase in my mind, is associated with all sorts of objective physiologic changes, some of which have been listed here by John Kerr, that really summarized the work of Ron Glaser and Cohen. And so saying that stress is linked to any illness does not say that that means that someone is really weak of character, and if they could just get on top of their stress, they wouldn't be sick. It says that stress leads to physiologic changes that may make us vulnerable to lots of different diseases. John Kerr presented this paper in which he compared patients with fatigue to the stress index and compared the status during acute infection with follow-up, and argued that, in fact, in his parvovirus subset of patients, a pre-existing state of stress at the time of the acute parvovirus infection made them more vulnerable not only to the clinical syndrome of post-infectious or post-parvo CFS, but also altered them immunologically in a way that made them vulnerable. What about links to other diseases? A medical student, Ms. Hone, presented a sleep study, 61 patients, reasonably sized study, that found a much higher prevalence of sleep apnea, alpha intrusion, and limb movement disorders in patients with CFS than has been reported by most other studies. This phenomenon, the alpha intrusion in particular, has been hotly debated in the literature since Harvey Moldavsky first reported it in patients with fibromyalgia. There is a lot of disagreement on how you interpret, how you label something alpha intrusion on EEG, but Moldavsky and I think most of the literature on this subject finds in both CFS patients and fibromyalgia patients a higher frequency of alpha intrusion than in controls. There were no controls reported here. Boneva's paper on gynecologic abnormalities in patients with CFS, there are many interesting things about it. The one that I found most interesting was the link, the significant link, to endometriosis. I think this is interesting because I've been impressed by not only how many patients tell me that there's a link between endometriosis and their chronic fatigue syndrome, but by how many other physicians who see patients with, in large numbers, with CFS have also presumed a link with endometriosis. Several surveys of patient support groups have found a link between endometriosis and CFS, but that's very questionable epidemiology. These patients came from a community-based study in which the cases of CFS were not even self-identified. They were identified by community outreach, and the controls were similarly identified at random by community outreach. So here you have, I think, the first serious piece of evidence that there may be a link between endometriosis and chronic fatigue syndrome, or at least that CFS may make one vulnerable to endometriosis or vice versa. A very dramatic claim was made by Gagan and her colleagues from a relatively small data set here in Nevada that patients with mantle cell lymphoma, an unusual kind of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, were found much more often than expected in particular geographic region in Nevada. The number, as I understood the paper, the number of cases was small enough that statistical power, that didn't have statistical power to really nail down an association statistically, but the ratio of the observed to expected cases of 42 in any such epidemiologic study is a really high ratio. And it may not be statistically significant given the numbers of cases identified thus far, but given the natural history of lymphomas, if this association is real, it will only grow and become statistically significant in the coming 5 to 10 years.